Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Pak.
I'm Milo.
And it is just the two of us. Alexa, play just the two of us. If you have an Alexa, I apologize. And we're here with part 2 of the How to Warm Up, or the All About Warm-Ups episode series, to talk about a few things that we missed out on the previous episode, as well as some of your questions. But before we get into that, Alexa is actually playing the song in my living room. That's crazy. Alexa, be quiet. Nice. Now the listener plus viewer got to see that. Hey, that was crazy. Anyways, 24th of September, allegedly, a certain preprint of a certain study is out, Dr. Wolf. Full range of motion versus lengthened partials in trained individuals. I want to give the audience a snippet of the results. Obviously, we're not going to go in detail in this episode, but, you know, the usual how we're doing.
Listen, if the listener had the audacity and the courage and the bravery to click on part 2 of a podcast series about warm-ups, we have the duty to give them something nice instead, aka a full breakdown of the latest lengthened partial study. Without further ado, let me briefly describe the results. This study was preprinted as of Saturday, I believe. So I believe that was like, the 20th of September? 21st. Here's the abbreviated version of the design and results. We previously mentioned this, but effectively we took trained lifters who had an average training experience of about 5 years and had them perform single limb training. With one of their arms, all the training they did was with a full range of motion. With the other arm, all the training they did was with lengthened partials only. In contrast to previous studies that only ever included a single exercise, we used a more complete program, something people would actually use in the real world, in an attempt to boost ecological validity. Effectively, just design a study whose results would translate more directly and more effectively to your practices, dear listener, who might be doing a variety of exercises and might have been lifting for a while now. Because one of the common claims around lengthened partials, or lengthened training in general, is that they act via stretch-mediated hypertrophy. We've discussed that at length on the Strong by Science website. There's a whole article on it you can check out. But one of those claims is that stretch-mediated hypertrophy only occurs in beginner lifters, and therefore, in more trained lifters, doing lengthened partials wouldn't do anything, or wouldn't have any benefit whatsoever. So that was one gap in the evidence. Previously, there weren't really any studies in more well-trained lifters. So we set out to perform the study with the help of Jeff Nippard, who funded the study and helped with recruiting trained lifters. We're in New York for the majority of the summer to help out with the study. And effectively, the measurements we took were thicknesses of the biceps and the triceps before and after the 8-week intervention. Since we used a within-participant design, where one limb was being trained with full range of motion and one with lengthened partials, many of the usual confounders of differences in sleep between different individuals of the groups, or differences in genetics, maybe one group on average had better genetics than the other, or nutrition. All of those differences are largely washed out on account of you're training one of your arms with one approach and the other with a different approach. Differences in nutrition, or your nutrition, will impact both conditions the same way. So we can account for many confounders and effectively just bolster our statistical power in trying to determine whether there is an effect of one intervention versus another on our outcome of interest, in this case hypertrophy. We measured a thickness of the biceps and triceps, a composite, so not just the biceps but also the other elbow flexors, at 45 and 55% of muscle length, so a more proximal site and a more distal site, for both the elbow flexors and the elbow extensors. And to make a long story short, we observed the same hypertrophy across the board between both conditions. If you squint just right, you could trick yourself into thinking there might be a benefit to lengthened partials for the biceps, and there might be a benefit of full range of motion for the triceps. But the difference was small enough that in all likelihood, it is just sort of random noise versus there being a true effect of one approach being superior for hypertrophy. And in fact, when we analyzed the data using a Bayesian approach, the results indicated anecdotal to moderate support in favor of the null hypothesis, meaning there is no difference in how much muscle growth can be obtained via full range of motion approach or lengthened partials. So that is the TLDR there. A couple of minor interpretations off the back of it. One interpretation you can make is that because we didn't observe any difference in hypertrophy in the present study, it may be that training at a sufficiently long muscle length is sufficient to maximize hypertrophy. So that's actually a take that our dearly departed co-host Greg Knuckles has had. And by dearly departed, I mean just currently not on the podcast, still very much alive, but RIP nevertheless. He's basically made the claim that the existing studies don't really provide strong support for the notion of needing to train at the longest possible muscle lengths, but rather just, hey, training at longer muscle lengths is a good thing. Whether or not you need to chase the maximum muscle length is debatable based on the current evidence. And our study kind of provides some support in favor of that notion, because when we compared a full range of motion with a stretch emphasis, in the full range of motion condition with that limb, they were still doing a full pause in the stretch position. They were still chasing the maximum stretch available within that exercise. And so they weren't skimping on the stretch position, and they were training on average at relatively long muscle lengths. And that seemingly was sufficient to maximize hypertrophy. So that's one stance you can take, is that there is a sort of threshold that you need to hit with muscle length to maximize hypertrophy. The counter argument there is that there's just not that many studies actually looking at that, so it's probably premature to say that's the case for sure. It's very possible that there is an effect. We just don't have the studies yet to be able to really tell. The other argument you can make in light of this research and previous studies as well is that the shortened position just doesn't really seem to be offering much in the way of additional hypertrophy. So almost whenever a more lengthened form of training has been compared to a more shortened form of training, so for example, a lengthened isometric to a shortened isometric contraction, or a lengthened partial to a shortened partial, or a full range of motion to a shortened partial, where the full range of motion on average is being performed at longer muscle lengths, or a lengthened partial to a full range of motion. Across the board, we have around 25 studies performing these comparisons of a more shortened form of training and a more lengthened form of training. And almost invariably, with exceptions that I can count on one hand effectively, lengthened training results in the same hypertrophy or more hypertrophy. So with the prevalence of greater hypertrophy being seen from shorter training being so low, and in this study in a very ecologically valid setting, there being no benefit of including the shortened position in the full range of motion condition, we can seemingly say with pretty high confidence that the shortened position probably isn't increasing your hypertrophy. Otherwise, in this study, as in previous studies, we would have seen worse hypertrophy from incorporating the shortened position. So that's another takeaway. I think the most realistic takeaway, in my opinion, is our study, despite our best efforts, may just not have been sufficiently powered to detect any potential differences. Keep in mind, our study was one of the most highly powered ones. We had 25 participants. It was a within participant design. So just as a very rough and inaccurate heuristic, you could think of it as having 25 limbs in each group for a total sample size of 50, right? That is a relatively large sample size for the field and for specifically range of motion research. And even in spite of that, there's a good chance that the effect is pretty small. And with that time frame, in advanced lifters, who on average grew only 5 to 6% over 8 weeks, detecting differences between two different interventions might have been difficult. Like, let's say, for example, that, hey, lengthened partials did actually cause more growth, and they on average caused an 8% increase over 8 weeks, whereas the full range of motion condition caused a 4% increase. That's a sufficiently small difference that it can very easily be overshadowed by measurement error, random variance, all sorts of things. So it's possible and relatively likely that our power was not ideal. But just keep that in mind when you look at other research as well, because that is very often the case in resistance training research and exercise science at large, which is why a single study should never undermine or overtake your whole view on a topic. Now, there are some minor exceptions to this. I think that it's worth drawing a distinction between a single experimental study and a meta-study. In the case of a meta-analysis or a systematic review, there is a reason why that's at the top of the hierarchy of evidence. Because effectively, you're looking at oftentimes dozens of individual experimental studies all pulled together, so that the limitations in terms of power, study design, what have you, of each individual study can be overcome sort of in a strength in numbers approach. But in this case, with it being a single experimental study, in a field where we already had around 25 studies overall, and around 5 studies-ish comparing lengthened partials and a full range of motion specifically, that single study should only shift our consensus by so much, effectively. In a Bayesian framework, as we used in the analysis for our paper, you have your prior beliefs about a topic. In the light of new evidence and new data, you will shift those prior beliefs by an amount proportionate to the strength of the evidence compared to the strength of your prior belief and what evidence that prior belief was based upon. So in this case, we have around 25 studies again, which is a relatively strong prior belief in my view. And we have a new study, which, yes, we think is a very important study on account of being ecologically valid, on account of being one of the most highly powered studies in the field, if not the most, when it comes to range of motion. But it remains nevertheless a single study, which should only shift your prior consensus or stance so much. So, on net balance, I personally still think lengthened partials are a good bet for maximizing hypertrophy, whether in a trained population or not. But yeah, that's the short version.
Yeah, respect. That was the best way to explain that summary.
Pak, any additional thoughts on the study for another 45 minutes?
Yeah, so let's start by visually describing each of the sets performed by the participants frame by frame. So, participant 1. No, I'm joking, obviously. Now, that was a very good summary. You can check out the preprint on Sport Archive by going to rangeofmotion.study on your browser. We've had that domain for years. It wasn't just for this study. And yeah, looking forward to hearing everybody's thoughts. It's also part of the Stronger by Science communities, which I will plug in a second. So I've posted it on the Facebook community, which you can also join. So the Stronger by Science community on Facebook and Reddit both have a lot of like-minded people that love lifting. So before we get into warm-ups now, an area that can be somewhat controversial, especially in certain worlds, let me just do our usual plugs, and I hope I nail this. So if you're enjoying the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends, the latter being almost a legal requirement. It really helps us out. If you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training and or nutrition, Stronger by Science has a team of excellent coaches that can help you. Awesome roster, people with all sorts of expertise, all sorts of backgrounds, both athletic and educational. Check out strongerbyScience.com/coaching for more information. If you want to buy supplements and you want to buy the infamous tall pill that Milo featured in his breakdown video of the study that he just talked about, that supplement doesn't exist and is not available. But if you want to buy a solid supplement like creatine monohydrate, for example, you can buy from bulksupplements.com, which will allow you to not only get it from a reliable source, but also support the podcast. Use code SBSPOD for 5% off. Facebook group and subreddit, as I mentioned, awesome communities, Stronger by Science on Reddit and on Facebook. Lots of people there interacting on a daily basis on all things, not just lifting and science, but like physical activity and science. Check out the newsletter. So we do send out very high quality informative content in the form of a newsletter. No spamming, no ads, no BS. You can sign up at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. And if you want to potentially get your question answered on one of these podcasts, you can send us a voice note over at podcast@strongerbyscience.com. Or if you're part of the communities, as I mentioned, you can also take part in the Q&A posts that Milo and I make there. Awesome. Feel free to check out part one, of this episode series if you want to hear Greg talk about his experience with stretching and how he implements stretching, as well as some of the general research on stretching, warm-ups, what warm-ups are supposed to achieve, the research on injury prevention, but for now, we're going to look at warm-ups for strength and hypertrophy. Dr. Wolf.
The warm-up expert is here.
Let's hear
talk
it.
about the research. All right, so in part 1, as Pak put it, we talked about the effects of warm-ups on injury prevention and stretching as well, with Greg explaining many of his practices in stretching. This time we're talking about how to warm up for strength and hypertrophy. So some of the things we mentioned last time around what a good warm-up is supposed to achieve for preparing you for a workout and for exercise more broadly. Just to recap, organisms generally function most efficiently at higher temperatures. So one of the main aims of a good warm-up is simply to increase muscle temperature. For instance, at higher muscle temperatures, muscle glycogen availability increases, there's improvement in your oxygen kinetics, whether it's delivery of the oxygen towards your muscles or the extraction from the blood into your muscles. A variety of things happen. And importantly, the effects of warm-ups on performance appear not to just be physiological, such as an increase in muscle temperature or improvements in oxygen kinetics or just in general improving energy metabolism, but also potentially have neural components and psychological components. So there is some research on the post-activation performance enhancement effect, for example, or PAPE for short. There's some research on psychological warm-up strategies like visualization, saying keywords, attentional focus. These things generally help to narrow your attentional focus on the task at hand and build your self-confidence or your sense of competence going into performing a difficult task like exercising. Specifically, when it comes to warming up, muscle temperature at least usually seems to reach an equilibrium after around 10 to 20 minutes of moderate intensity exercise. So that could be something like walking, incline walking, or what have you. But it seems like warm-ups have the potential to improve performance during a hypertrophy or strength workout via a variety of mechanisms that span from physiological, psychological, and even neural. That doesn't mean we need to make things extremely complicated though. And we have a fair body of research looking at the effects of different warm-ups on performance when it comes to a strength-based workout and hypertrophy-based workout. Now, that's in contrast to the research we have on warming up for injury, where things are quite sparse, especially when it comes to lifting. When it comes to performance, at least, we do have a fair bit of research. However, there is one big caveat to that statement. While we do have research on how a specific warm-up intervention or approach will impact performance in the subsequent session, that doesn't necessarily tell us much about long-term hypertrophy. And this is an issue we come across time and time again in different areas of evidence. There's a few reasons for why that's the case. For one, studying an acute outcome, like for example performance during a session, is much, much, much more resource-friendly than actually measuring hypertrophy. If you're looking at the effect of a warm-up on performance, that is going to take you maybe 2 to 4 experimental sessions per participant. So as a rough ballpark, you can think 2 to 4 hours per participant that you're including in your study, and you have a study. So for a sample size of 30 or 50, you might be talking about around 100 hours of total labor. If you're doing a training study instead, wherein you measure the muscle size before and after different groups use the same warm-up strategy consistently across the study, you might be multiplying that time commitment by approximately 5 to 10 times oftentimes, because you're now committing to training the participants in the lab for often 8 to 12 weeks instead of just one-off. And therefore, you'll be spending much, much more time to conduct that study compared to an acute study simply looking at performance. So that's one big reason. The other reason is it is easier to recruit participants for a study that is less work as well. So if I told you, hey, give me control over your training for the next 12 weeks, you might not be very happy to hear me ask that of you. And you might not be inclined to say yes. But if I ask you instead, hey, could you just come into a lab for 3 or 4 days total and do different warm-up protocols and maybe max out on the bench for a few sets? Yeah, I'll be like, yeah, sure, I can help you out. So there's a variety of reasons why these studies are much more commonly done than longitudinal studies, but it boils down to feasibility, effectively. Also, most sports and most actual sports, much to my dismay, bodybuilding might not be considered a sport. Most sports care about performance quite heavily. And so if you can find a way to boost performance via a better warm-up strategy, that is going to be more important to most people and most funding bodies compared to what boosts hypertrophy the most. So when you kind of weigh up the cost versus benefit of doing a longitudinal study on hypertrophy or strength development versus just an acute study on performance and the effects of different warm-ups, that is why we often only see acute studies. In this case, it's just worth keeping in mind that the studies we're about to discuss may find that a certain warm-up approach is best for boosting performance in a given hypertrophy workout, but that doesn't necessarily mean that will translate to more hypertrophy in the long run. For example, as a little spoiler, many of the warm-up strategies seem to boost performance predominantly on the first set, or maybe the first couple of sets of a hypertrophy workout. Thereafter, it seems like performance is largely the same, potentially because you've already reached like adequate muscle temperature, you've already done a set or two, so the priming effects neurally, for example, the post-activation performance enhancement effect, have been achieved purely via doing an actual wax set. And so the subsequent sets are already maximized performance-wise through the prior sets you've performed. So that is worth keeping in mind. There are cases as well where even though a given training intervention or change to your training might improve performance, it doesn't necessarily translate to an increase in hypertrophy observed, for instance. So as an example, when you take longer rest times, let's say, for example, 3, 4, 5 minutes, 6 minutes plus between sets, you'll usually see at least slightly better performance for a lot of people, in certain movements at least. And yet, when you look at the empirical research on the topic of rest times for hypertrophy, you see that 1 to 2 minutes seems to lead to very solid growth, and arguably the best growth. You don't need to rest much more than 2 minutes or so to maximize your hypertrophy. And so with rest times, for instance, that is a situation in which if you were to purely look at what maximized performance across the workout, thinking that that would translate to additional hypertrophy, you'd probably be mistaken. Other examples of this kind of limitation of research include citrulline malate, for instance. So the most evidence-based, quote-unquote, supplement out there is probably creatine monohydrate, because we actually have quite a few studies looking at lean body mass or direct muscle mass measurements from taking creatine in conjunction with lifting compared to just lifting. And so we have a control group, we actually measure the outcome of interest, and we have longitudinal studies, and quite a few of them. With something like citrulline malate, which does seem to reliably boost performance a little bit for bodybuilding style workouts, we simply don't have any longitudinal research on its effects on hypertrophy. So while you can make the claim that, hey, citrulline malate does these things which improve performance, nitric oxide, boost blood flow, energy metabolism, all that stuff, you cannot make a claim with high certainty that that improvement in performance will necessarily yield more hypertrophy. It stands to reason, but as we've demonstrated with the rest time example, for instance, there's cases where that might not necessarily play out the way you want it to. So that is one huge limitation of the existing warm-up research, in that we don't have those longitudinal studies. So for hypertrophy, it seems like getting close to failure in a set is the main thing. While you might get an extra rep or two across 5 sets by following a certain acute warm-up strategy, and that does constitute a performance boost, whether that then goes on to increase growth long-term is another question. Importantly, with warm-up specifically, it's not as though there isn't an opportunity cost. So when we're talking about warming up, we're talking about spending additional time in the gym, or oftentimes spending more of your limited time in the gym warming up and not training hard, performing hard sets, which ultimately are the thing that is going to contribute to growth the most, not whether you get an additional rep on your first set. And so for many clients, speaking from a coaching experience now, which Pak can touch on afterwards, I would prioritize getting more sets into a given workout than making a warm-up go from 5 to 15 minutes. So adding 10 minutes of warming up to my client's workout. Generally, I think that you are usually better served spending more of your time doing actual sets and less of your time warming up, at least for hypertrophy, and the research around that we'll get into in a second. But Pak, what do you think?
Yeah, specifically for hypertrophy, it's something that I discuss with clients quite a bit, because it intuitively makes some sense that, especially if you've come up either in a strength sort of a background, if you've started training, you just mostly doing strength-based programs and hearing about warm-ups and seeing other people warm up, or even if you had like an athletic background before you got into more specific training for muscle growth, to have this idea that warm-ups are absolutely essential, extremely important, and a significant amount of time should be allocated towards them if you want to maximize adaptations and if you want to maximize performance in the context of hypertrophy, to therefore maximize adaptations. But when it comes to my advice, based on the current literature to clients, is that warm-ups should not be viewed as anything more than just a quick chance at the beginning of the workout to get their heart rate up, perhaps perform a couple of sets on their first exercise, depending obviously on the exercises. Some will require more time than others, depending on whether there's a skill component or not, and not really worry about them much, especially if they're performing subsequent exercises that target the same musculature, where they literally do not need to warm up whatsoever. As a general rule of thumb, if you want to do like a very quick set for like 10 to 20 seconds where you essentially perform the exercise with a slightly lighter load than your working set, just so that you can be like, okay, yeah, this feels fine, and then literally wait a few seconds and just get into your main set. It's something that people sometimes tend to overthink, and I think warm-ups for hypertrophy are more on the overrated side than the underrated side. So yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, I think our experiences mirror one another quite closely, almost as though we are, in fact, podcast co-hosts on Muscle and Feels and Strong Life Science, and we are effectively of the same mind. Cool, let's pivot on to the actual research. And there's about 6 studies that I wanted to break down. I'm not going to go into depth into each one, simply because many of them have similar results, and these are some of the most recent studies on lifting and performance. This is quasi-systematic review-like, and the reason for that is there hasn't been a systematic review on warm-ups for performance in hypertrophy training in quite a while. But effectively, we have 6 studies that have all been conducted over the past 3-4 years at this stage. So we are getting a fair bit of research in the area as of recently. The most recent study I can think of is a study by Viveros and colleagues from 2024 titled High Load and Low Volume Warm-Up Increases Performance in a Resistance Training Session. So as the title implies, they looked at different warm-up strategies and found that the heavier but lower volume, or fewer repetitions, warm-up was beneficial. They looked specifically at the bench press, the lat pull-down, and the leg press, and they compared doing a set of 5 reps with 80% of their max as a warm-up, to doing a set of 10 reps with 60% of their max as a warm-up, to doing a set of 15 reps with 40% of their max as a warm-up. Following this individual set at different intensities for different number of reps, they then performed 3 sets to failure with either the bench press, the pull-down, or leg press. And effectively, the high load warm-up was most beneficial, which is to say 5 reps with 80% of your max. Now that's pretty close to a wax set, but as we'll see in just a moment, generally the higher the load being used during warming up, the more beneficial the effects on performance subsequently seem to be. And this is kind of the general finding of the area of research in warming up that I referred to earlier as post-activation performance enhancement effect. That doing something heavy being somewhere between 70 to 90% of your max before your hypertrophy work sets, seems to be beneficial. So in this case, 80% for 5 reps beat both 60% for 10 reps and 40% for 15 reps. And those latter 2 approaches were similarly effective in terms of how much were participants able to lift in the subsequent set to failure on bench press, pull down, and leg press. So that's the first study. Then we have another study in 2020 by Ribeiro and colleagues looking at the squat and the bench press. They compared 3 warm-up approaches yet again, and I actually broke this down recently for a short we had on the Strong by Science Instagram and YouTube, so go check that out if you haven't already. They compared doing a single set of 6 repetitions with 40% of your max to doing a single set of 6 repetitions with 80% of your max, kind of similar to that previous study we just spoke of, or doing both sets, so doing 40% of their max for 6, then 80% of their max for 6, and then their first wax set. They looked at performing 3 sets of 6 at 80% of their max as their working sets, and they assessed performance via things like bar velocity, impulse, and other performance-related variables. Because importantly, in this case, they didn't go to failure on those sets. They simply did 3 sets of 6 reps at 80% of their max, which is a bit of a throwback to the percentage-based programming days. But effectively, they observed the best performance in terms of velocity, impulse, and so forth when the warm-up consisted of both a 40% set and an 80% set. So one relatively lighter set and one pretty heavy set. But the performance observed with that approach was actually fairly similar to just doing a set with 80% of your max. 40% was by far the worst in terms of the performance observed. So yet again, it seems like the main thing, and potentially almost the exclusive thing to pay attention to, is doing a heavy set before your main wax sets for hypertrophy. Next, we have a study by Souza and colleagues from 2023. Following different warm-up approaches, the participants performed 3 sets on the back squat at 75% of their max for as many reps as they could. The different warm-up approaches that the researchers compared were doing 6 reps at 40% of their max, their usual warm-up, or 3 reps at 90% of their max. So a very, very heavy warm-up, and in fact probably close to a working set, close to failure, as their one warm-up approach. Before they performed these different warm-up interventions, they did all perform a set of 8 repetitions at 45% of their max as well, just to get them kind of generally warm. In this case, there were no major differences in performance between the 3 conditions, but all differences were in favor of the 3-rep condition, where they performed 3 reps at 90% of their max in terms of performance in the subsequent sets. So yet again, although it seems like having done a set beforehand kind of attenuates the benefit a little bit, the heavier set seems to be most beneficial. Next, we have a study by Conrado de Freitas and colleagues from 2021, where they compared 2 warm-up approaches. In both conditions, they performed 10 bodyweight squats first. In one condition, they didn't do anything thereafter. So that was their only warm-up, 10 bodyweight squats, and then they got straight into their 4 AMRAPs at 70% of their max on the squat. In the other condition, after doing their 10 bodyweight squats, they also performed a set of 2 repetitions at 90% of their max. So they jumped straight from bodyweight squats to 90% of their max. And effectively, the group that actually did a set of 2 at 90% observed much better performance. So on the first set specifically, the group that did the 90% set got about 6 extra reps with 70% of their max. So if, for example, in the condition where they didn't warm up, or they did just 10 bodyweight squats, they got 12 reps, they got 18 when they were doing that heavy set beforehand. So specifically on the first set, doing that heavy set beforehand, that post-activation performance enhancement set, seems to be quite beneficial. However, well, first, before we go there, they also tested maximum voluntary isometric contraction, which is just a very unskilled test of strength. And likewise, just like for the squat, they also saw greater performance when doing that really heavy set before moving in. However, when it came to subsequent sets, so as I mentioned, they tested 4 sets all out with 70% of their max. When it came to subsequent sets after the first set, their performance was effectively the same, whether or not they did any additional warming up past 10 bodyweight squats. So like I mentioned earlier, from the research, it really does seem like one heavy set is important, but it seems to be primarily important for boosting performance on that first set. And thereafter, it may not matter quite as much anymore. Next, we have a study by Alice and colleagues from 2021, where they compared 2 warm-up approaches. In both conditions, they first performed 8 repetitions at 50% of their max. In one condition, that was all they did. In the other condition, they also then performed a set of 3 repetitions at 90% of their max, resting 10 minutes afterwards before going into their first set, so getting plenty of rest. Then they all performed 3 sets of bench press to failure with 75% of their max yet again. Just like for the previous study by Conrado de Freitas and colleagues, On set 1 and set 2, the 90% condition warm-up did see more repetitions performed. So again, it seems like that heavy set really boosts performance on maybe the first set or two, but then by set 3, there were no differences in repetitions performed between the two conditions that either did a heavy warm-up or did not. The final study we want to discuss before giving some key takeaways is by Garbisu Huade and colleagues from 2023. Hope I pronounced that properly. They had two conditions. In both conditions, they performed a relatively extensive warm-up protocol consisting of 5 minutes of cycling, 10 reps with 40% of their max, 4 reps with 60% of their max, 2 reps at 70% of their max, and then a single rep at 80% of their max. Following this warm-up routine, both conditions then performed an AMRAP set with 80% of their max, so essentially getting as many reps as possible with 80% of their max. However, in the heavy warm-up condition, they then also performed a single rep at 93% of their max before resting for 6 minutes and going in for their testing set. So in one condition, they performed a really extensive warm-up up to the weight they were using for their walking set. And for the very heavy warm-up group, they also then performed a single repetition over their working weight at 93% of their max. And as you would expect based on the previous results, adding that single at a very high load of 93% of their max did actually improve performance. So they got more reps on their AMRAP set compared to the condition that just did a very extensive but submaximal and relatively light warm-up. And interestingly, the magnitude of the benefit from doing the additional heavy single was pretty similar to what we see in other studies, where doing a heavier warm-up boosts performance. So it seems like that whole very extensive warm-up protocol of doing 5 minutes of cycling, 10 reps at 40%, 4 reps at 60%, 2 reps at 70%, and the rep at 80% wasn't sufficient to maximize performance. It seems like what was really needed to boost performance in this regard on an AMRAP set of 80% of their max was simply doing a heavy set. Heavy being somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 90%. One key thing about this study is that they rested for about 6 minutes between the last heavy single at 93% and going in for their AMRAP set. And when you look at some of these studies, like a study I mentioned previously, where they rested for 10 minutes between the last heavy set and the first training set by Alves and colleagues, generally it is recommended that a few minutes of rest at least are taken between that heavy warm-up set before your first walking set so that you can get your best performance. That's the general takeaway from the post-activation performance enhancement effect research. Because otherwise residual fatigue could play a role in harming your performance if you did a really heavy set right before your walking set. But yeah, from this research, my own personal takeaway is that whether you want to do a lighter set, like let's say with 30 to 70% of your max, is relatively optional for hypertrophy work. But doing a pretty heavy set before your walking set is probably worth doing. So somewhere in the ballpark of 70 to 90% of your max seems to be beneficial for boosting performance thereafter for hypertrophy style work. Importantly though, the effect seems to be mostly constrained to the first set or two of hypertrophy work rather than being something that boosts performance for the rest of the workout. And as a result, maybe if you go relatively heavy for the first exercise of your workout, for instance, like say, for example, you do some heavy benching, and then you move into some skull crushers for higher reps, the fact that you went heavy enough for the bench press might potentiate performance thereafter. Because as we see in these studies, by set 3, sometimes even set 2, the difference in performance is effectively gone. And so it makes sense that because your set 1 was already pretty heavy, you don't see any additional benefit that could also carry over from one movement to the next, which to me at least kind of provides a couple of suggestions. One, if you already feel warm and went relatively heavy earlier in the session, you probably don't need to do a ton of warming up for exercise number 2, 3, 4, etc. And suggestion number 2 is to probably start your workouts with heavier work to potentially get a slight edge in performance for subsequent work. So you might want to start your session with heavier bench pressing and then move into lighter dumbbell pressing or what have you. So yeah, those are my takeaways, but I am keen to hear what my good co-host, Dr. Pak, has to say.
I completely disagree. So, yeah. No, there's nothing much more that I could possibly add there. I think even the TLDR we said at the beginning, obviously we can just give a TLDR without the appropriate evidence, but the TLDR of, a few heavy sets are probably going to do the trick in most cases, and for the majority of people, unless, again, you're working on a specific exercise and you're a competitive powerlifter and getting some more practice in helps you warm up, things are pretty straightforward. And warming up, if you also look at the previous episode where we talked about injury prevention, and in general, that warming up does not seem to be some sort of magical tool as far as that goes. Overall, biasing more time towards your actual training, I think makes most sense to me. And obviously, look, the argument for preference, and some people will tell you, but I like to get a bit more loose, do some mobility work. If I do a few more warm-up sets, that then allows me to feel the muscles more. That's always going to be fine. If you want to take this information and you want to just know that, hey, warm-ups do not appear to be magical, but for you specifically, certain modifications to the recommendations on the back of the literature make your workout better, that's totally fine. We're not by no means telling you that, hey, you should just stick to this, and if you do anything more, you are doing something wrong. But rather, if you're somebody that feels good after just a couple of hard sets and is ready to go, it's likely that you do not need to overthink warm-ups whatsoever. But allow me to add that if you're pressed for time and you are in the gym with your main goal being muscle growth and obviously strength increases, the latter will require a bit more time spent on warm-ups. But for the former, that's one of the few cases where I would make the argument that, hey, skip that warm-up, just get straight into it. You'd rather get 2 or 3 extra sets of actual potent hypertrophic stimulus versus doing, sometimes maybe 30 or 50% less volume because you're there warming up for each exercise, or you're doing, a very long general warm-up followed by a specific warm-up. Sit down on the first exercise, do a relatively heavy set as your warm-up. Don't go, you don't need to take that set to failure. Give it a minute and then straight into your working set.
Yeah, makes sense. I'll give some overall takeaways from the research and warming up for lifting. The first one would be that warming up before exercising is a good bet if you want to maximize performance. And that likely applies to not just lifting, but all exercise or different sports types. As I mentioned, there are some mechanistic underpinnings as to why we would expect warming up to be beneficial for performance, both physiologically, psychologically, and even neurally. So that's one thing. That doesn't mean you need to be super extensive, but for lifting specifically, a heavy warm-up set appears to be the main thing, and it does seem to increase performance in subsequent sets. What I mean by heavy is around 70 to 75 or more percent of your max. Like 75 to 90% of your max for one rep or a couple of reps seems to be sufficient. A second or third warm-up set may not be beneficial. Like whether or not you need to do a set of, say, 10 or 8 or whatever at 40% of your max before that, based on the research, not super clear. The main thing by far just seems to be a relatively heavy set before your working sets. The other thing that seems to be a good idea is to take at least a couple of minutes of rest between your potentiation or heavy warm-up set and your first working set, or until you just feel ready to perform at your best. So if you just did a set of 1 at 85% of your max, you may not feel ready to go for your working set until in a couple of minutes. Just take as long as you need, or at least you feel you need, to perform your best. For injury prevention, things are pretty unclear. As I mentioned in part 1, we don't really have any direct research on lifting injury risk and different warm strategies. That said, what research we do have on warming up and injury risk broadly seems to suggest that some multi-component warm-up protocols can help. So for instance, we spoke about the FIFA 11, where you have a wide variety of different modalities, like strength training, eccentric training, plyometrics, agility, mobility, stretching, a variety of things, to the point that it makes it difficult to tell what's going on. What is clear from the research is that lifting and strength training in general might be one of the most beneficial interventions for reducing sports injury risk. And so it's tempting to explain the results of interventions like the FIFA 11 by just saying, well, they performed lifting, eccentric exercises, and plyometrics, which do seem to have evidence in their favor for reducing injury risk. So it's not super clear even from this research, like the research on the FIFA 11, whether or not warming up will really prevent or reduce injury risk rather. So the final thing I'd say as well regarding static stretching is that we reviewed the evidence in part 1, but it doesn't seem to help prevent injury. So even though static stretching might be one of the most common forms of warming up or parts of a injury risk reduction protocol, whether or not it actually helps you reduce injury risk seems pretty unclear. If there is an effect, it would potentially be for musculotendinous injuries. However, there's a good chance that lifting would also cover you in that regard. So yeah, it's one of those things where lifting has relatively low injury rates, as we discussed in episode 1, and lifting seems to reduce injury risk in other activities. I'm not sure if we can say too much more from the research at this stage. Pak, can you think of anything else to add on those takeaways?
No, I think we've given enough general overview for warm-ups. I wish it was a bit sexier or a bit more like, hey, do this specific warm-up or follow these sort of principles, and you're going to be looking at substantially more muscle growth to the point where, you know, somebody warming up with a simple warm-up is probably missing out on gains. I'm not sure actually if I'd wish for that. It would be cool if there was like some weird trick you could do. But yeah, I think we've warmed up fully. I'm not sure what the verb would be there.
I
but
think
we have
the correct analogy is we're sufficiently warmed up to get into some Q&A.
Hey, that was nice. Yeah, I'll start us off with Maria LD Christina Daughter. Hope I pronounced this right, from the Facebook group. If you warm up a particular muscle group, but for some reason have to wait an unexpectedly long amount of time between sets or something, how much time can pass between sets before you have to warm that muscle group up again for maximum performance? Well, I'd say that obviously I don't think we have a study looking with a study design that would actually mimic that, and I assume that's something most of us have had to go through at some point in the gym, where you're talking to somebody or somebody calls you and then all of a sudden you've rested for 15 minutes. I would say that following the general guidelines we just gave and maybe just performing another warm-up set, a heavy warm-up set, just to be safe if you're feeling extremely cold and you want to ensure that you're maximizing performance, that should cover you. But if you're talking about like 10 to 15 minutes, I'd argue that you are likely to be even more ready to attack the next set and get maximum performance out of it. Obviously, it will depend on the exercise and what's distracting you from actually doing the set. So yeah, Milo?
I tend to agree. I think the couple of things to pay attention to are, one, in the warm-up research we do have, taking up to 5 to 10 minutes between the last heavy warm-up set and the first AMRAP is still sufficient to boost performance on the subsequent set. So like if it's under 5 or 10 minutes, I probably wouldn't worry about it, to be honest. The other minor thing to pay attention to is, do you feel warm anymore? Like, one of the things a good warm-up is supposed to achieve is to increase muscle temperature. If you feel like you're completely cold again, akin to when you first got in the gym or when you left home if you walked to the gym, if you feel like that again, I mean, for one, it's probably been more than 5 or 10 minutes, so it's kind of a catch-22 where both criteria are met. But for another, that might be a sign that you do need to repeat some of the warm-up protocol or do something for maximum benefit. And it might just be a matter of, okay, let me do a a quick set of 1 or 2 with about 75% of max, and I can get back into it. Or if you're really cold again, you could do some sort of movement, like doing 8 to 10 reps at 40% of your max before that. But for very few people and very few cases will that be necessary. And I think that if it's much less than 10 minutes and or you don't feel cold, you can probably just get straight back into it. Make sense?
Yep, for sure.
Cool. Let me tee up the next question for you in that case.
Awesome.
Next question is from Matt Soskins from Facebook. And he says, if I don't get injured, then to what extent does warming up matter? Would I be better served to use the time I would spend warming up doing an extra set? If my 1 rep max is 100 pounds and I do a warm-up set of 5 reps with 50 pounds, might I be better served pushing 50 pounds to failure and calling it a working set? Pak?
Yeah. If you're so pressed for time to the point where you can't afford that one set, probably yes. It's very difficult to say because the idea that if I don't get injured, it's not like we can safely predict injury. And as Milo said, warm-up seems to be a good idea overall for performance. So if you are there and on average you have 10 to 15 minutes to train and you want to absolutely maximize muscle growth in those 10 to 15 minutes or whatever time, then yeah, it likely makes a bit more sense to get that set, to turn that set into a working set. However, if you can spare the extra minute, I'd say it's a good idea to do, the couple of warm-up sets so that you can maximize performance for the exercise that you're performing. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of these sort of extreme scenario questions where it's like, I don't see many people not having that time. As I mentioned, if you are that one person or you have the odd week here and there where you're super limited in terms of time, then fine. But on average, do your best to include some form of warm-up there.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I think I'm a bit more amenable to that scenario. I don't think I can make a compelling case at this stage that a lifter who does not warm up for lifting for hypertrophy is really increasing injury risk or decreasing hypertrophy. So yeah, if you're pretty busy, your warm-up approach might be very minimal. And let's say for example you're doing an upper body day, right? If you're pretty busy, I would probably just do 1 or 2 warm-up sets on your first movement, and then just almost get straight into exercise to exercise without warming up for individual exercises. And that would take you 3 to 5 minutes tops warming up, especially if you've walked to the gym and your muscle temperature is somewhat elevated already. But equally, when I get very busy, I wouldn't mind doing my first set at 50% of my max as an AMRAP, although I would probably go a bit higher anyways because I don't want to do 20 reps or more. But yeah, I don't think it's something to worry about overly. If you're super busy, you can get straight into it for hypertrophy. And if you have any amount of spare time, even 3 to 5 minutes, I would probably just do the warm-up for the first exercise or two, or any exercise that you're doing where you don't feel warmed up yet in that area. If you start with bench press, and then you're moving on to rows, maybe do the same for your rows. But then thereafter, your whole body's pretty warmed up, upper body-wise, and you don't need to worry about doing warm-up sets for your bicep curls, for instance, necessarily. So yeah, I don't think there are any hard and fast rules as far as you need to warm up to maximize hypertrophy, or we have clear evidence that you need to, and you're going to kill your gains if you don't.
Yeah, for sure. Big Jonathan Stud from Reddit asks, do you need warm-up sets for an exercise you're doing 20 plus reps per set on, or would the earlier reps suffice as a warm-up?
So that's something where I think the research is pretty helpful, because most of the studies we have on multiple sets of lifting, usually they're looking at 70 to 80% of your max. So it's not quite a set of 20 reps, but it is a set of frequently 10 to 15 or maybe even up to 20 sometimes. So it's in that rough ballpark. And in those studies, doing a heavier set before your whacking set did seem to boost performance, at least on the first set, and sometimes on the second. Now, whether or not that increase in performance is sufficient to warrant spending an extra 5 minutes warming up, I don't know. But what I can say is that the earlier reps from that set wouldn't be sufficient. because it seems like one of the key things of a warm-up for lifting is to go pretty heavy. And the first couple of reps with your 20 rep max, the weight simply isn't sufficient enough to give you the benefit of warm-up. So as far as the benefit of the warm-up itself goes, for performance, no, the early reps wouldn't suffice. But whether or not it matters in the grand scheme of things as far as stimulating hypertrophy, I don't really know. I'm not sure it matters all that much.
Yeah.
Zach?
Again, yeah, I agree, because like you're, so, I don't know, like looking directly at the evidence that is available at the moment is your best bet, and trying to sort of work around it to see if you can incorporate the warm-up in the working set just doesn't make sense. As it stands, heavy set, good, then you can do your high rep set. So
I think it's reasonable. Cool. Next up, I will tee us off. We have a question by the High Mag on Reddit. And it goes, I think it's some takes and then a question. Well, actually, he has one take, as he describes. He says, takes in ascending levels of heat, brackets, I have just one take. And his take is, non-specific warm-ups, stretching, foam rolling, agile 8, whatever, are net negative. So let's first respond to that before we move into this question. Pak, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to semi-agree, because
middle, respect.
Yeah, I'm trying to be as safe as I can here. So obviously context matters, but usually, at least from my own experience, stretching, foam rolling, agile 8, and a bunch of warm-up protocols are often come with a hefty, or at least some form of nocebo when it comes to like injury and the effect of warm-ups on injury specifically, sprinkled with buzzwords like, you know, myofascial release and all sorts of stuff, and getting your glutes to fire before a squat and yada, yada, yada. So they are usually, at least from my own experience, presented as game changers for both performance and injury prevention. From a literature standpoint, we see that aside from some increases in range of motion, which can also be achieved with lifting, you're not looking at either performance increases or actual injury prevention. So for a lot of people that buy into a lot of the warm-up tools and techniques that are out there, I feel that one, they're wasting more time because they believe that they're preventing injury and that they're potentiating performance. And because I could be spending that time actually lifting. And at the same time, I feel that they reinforce a mindset of being frail and needing to do a bunch of warming up in order to actually get into your lifting. So I semi-agree with that statement, but again, keep in mind, you can be an evidence-based lifter that says, hey, like, I know it's not going to do much for me, but when I foam roll before, I really like how it feels on my hips, and my squat feels better when I do it. I know that that's not going to stop me from getting injured. I'm still managing my workload and stress appropriately because I know that that's what likely matters most.
I think that's pretty reasonable. I think when it comes to lifting specifically, unless you're dealing with some sort of prior injury or pain where your medical professionals advised you to, hey, do some stretching or do some foam rolling or agile 8. With that caveat out of the way, I think the lifter who is lacking in flexibility or mobility to achieve their goal is pretty rare. And the lifter who is in that position typically is relatively new to lifting, such that in due time they would achieve the required flexibility to maximize their outcome of interest anyways through just lifting. So if you lift with a full range of motion for about 6 months, even though you might have just started lifting and you're not particularly flexible yet, and so you might be worried that, hey, I'm not reaching long enough muscle lengths to maximize hypertrophy, I think that pretty quickly you would be able to through just lifting. The one scenario where I can kind of think of stretching, foam rolling, agile 8, whatever, being beneficial would be in the context of a strength sport where you're consistently unable to have the required flexibility to optimize your technique. Like, if, for example, you are very, very inflexible in your thoracic spine, and therefore you cannot arch on the bench whatsoever for powerlifting. And you find that stretching or foam rolling between warm-up sets on the bench allows you to get into that position, and by arching, you're able to lift more weight, and by doing that, you're over time able to get your body used to that position and become permanently more flexible and flexible enough to maximize your performance in that sport. I can see a point to that. But I think that's relatively uncommon. And I think that flexibility and mobility in the strength sports specifically have become a bit of a buzzword, where like people think they need to maximize and optimize their flexibility and mobility to really be the best powerlifter they can be, and like spend half an hour on their rest days foam rolling, because otherwise they'll get stiff, and that's a bad thing. I think most people are overly concerned with that. And so like I would say in 95% of scenarios, I agree with this hot take, that it is probably in the negative, that instead you could be spending more time lifting or time relaxing. The remaining 5%, or effectively, if you enjoy doing it, you do you, king or queen. And if you're a strength athlete who really thinks they'd be better off doing that before a workout to become more flexible, fair enough, and improve your performance, fair enough. That's about it, though. Yeah, hot take, I agree with.
Yep.
Cool. Nice. Let me tee off the actual question the high man.
All right, let me beatbox.
All right, set the beat. Is there any research with respect to the efficacy of potentiating the body for higher rep bounce by warming up with a load in excess of the expected working weight, i.e. for a targeted rep max, handling some singles, doubles, triples above that weight before settling in for the rep work? Insert plug for Dr. Pak talking about Dr. Mike, about how to power build the right way, and a brief reference to the potentiation when you do your strength work before your hypertrophy work. Check out Dr. Pak's channel. Plug. And yeah, what do you think, Pak? Singles, doubles, triples above the target weight before doing the rep work?
I think you are the right person here, because the potentiation effect, I remember that used to be like a Milo Wolf classic back in the day, the heavy set before the actual work, right?
Bro, I've been tapped in with the warm-up research for a while, you see, like since I was 20 years old or something. Yeah, the potentiation set has become a bit of a meme amongst the friend group, because like people would just be like, hey, let's get into your set, we've done the light warm-up, let's get into it. And I was like, nah, let me do a quick rep or two with the working weight or a bit above it. And then I get into the set, and people used to laugh at me. Now they still laugh at me. So life is sad. But yeah, I think it's based on the research. Again, doing a heavy set with 75 to 90% of your max before your working set for hypertrophy work might boost your performance on the first set or two. Might be a good thing in the long run. Not something to obsess over, but takes literally 5 seconds. So it might be worth doing.
Yeah. I'd say that unless, look, like you doing a single, double, or triple before, if you have the time to spare, you may be looking at some extra strength gains there, and it's not really a big deal. But using that rule as a must versus just handling like a load that is close to your working set, I think for some people can actually lead to more time spent doing stuff that doesn't really align with their goals. So working up to a heavy single on the squat may take a bit more time, may take some psychological preparation depending on your style of lifting. And at the same time, you could have just done like let's say you're squatting 200 pounds. You could have done a set of 3 at 180 pounds before, or a set of, set of 3, set of 2, whatever. A heavy set with a weight close to your working weight, and then do your high rep set. So yeah, not a bad idea. You're not going to be losing gains for sure, and you might make some strength gains as well, but at the same time, nothing too crazy.
Sounds reasonable to me. Moving on
to
our final question on Reddit. 420 years ago asks, would your recommendations change for someone in their 40s or above? Pak, tee us off.
No, not really. Unless, again, like obviously evidence-based practice means that we also take the person's preference and unique circumstances in consideration. If that person has had multiple injuries and psychologically it helps them to move around a bit more, yada, yada, yada. For some exercises, yes, potentially. And that's just an assumption. because I'm biased because I've worked with a lot of masters powerlifters who are competing at a high level. So, some injuries and pains and aches come with the territory. But for a lifter, just a regular lifter who's 40 and is looking to make solid muscle gains, no, recommendations would be the exact same, obviously with the same disclaimers as well. And hey, just if you want to do a bit more or a bit less, up to you.
I think that's reasonable. I largely agree. It may be a case of absence of evidence versus evidence of absence, but like none of the research points towards there being a necessity for different recommendations. I think that generally the beliefs of older lifters tend to be more cautious around injury or a bit more wary of them and tend to perceive that lifting has a relatively high injury risk or tend to more readily get injured. If you feel like warming up more is going to safeguard you somewhat, feel free to do it, but just be aware that from the research side of things, there's basically nothing to really suggest it. As long as you're achieving the basic guidelines of you've warmed up enough to feel relatively warm and you've done a relatively heavy set before your first working set for hypertrophy, I couldn't claim that you're missing out on anything, or at least there's no evidence to substantiate that claim. So, yeah, that's my take. I think we largely see eye to eye on that, Pack.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, the idea that you are this sort of frail individual at the age of 40, same with some of the like more sexist assumptions with women training as well. Like, you're fine. You're totally fine. You're not going to break in half, and you don't need to warm up for hours and hours and do foam rolling, and be careful. Just obviously don't YOLO it, but that applies for younger people as well.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think in general, if you want good resources for injury prevention advice, quote unquote, things like, or people like, not things, barbell medicine, strength and evidence physio, no bullshit physio on Instagram, clinical athlete,
Greg
those
Lehman.
types of resources will serve you well. But yeah, at least from the research side of things, and we had a physio look over all this stuff. Shout out to Strength and Evidence Physio. At least from the research side of things, I don't think there's anything to worry about. Happy to be refuted, disproven, debunked. But I can't say there's anything. Pack, warm-ups, anything to add from your experience as a coach or an athlete?
For powerlifters specifically, don't buy into the hype of the 30-minute warm-up with 8 corrective exercises and 7 different random circuits. Even for highly trained powerlifters, gradually increasing the load on the bar while performing squat, bench, or deadlift is likely going to be more than enough. And in some cases, based at least on the current literature, it might be more than you actually need to get you ready for your working set. If you want to do some general warm-up to get your heart rate up, perfectly fine, like some light cycling for 5 minutes or like walking incline for 5 minutes. But spending hours and hours doing corrective exercises, not hours, minutes and minutes, doing corrective exercises and drills before your SBD or whatever, S or B or D session, IMO, doesn't make much sense. And it's more of a cultural thing from my own observation versus something that you actually should be concerned about.
Did you just commit the McNamara fallacy?
Shout out to McNamara Airport in a terminal in Detroit.
I think is it a terminal?
Or is it the airport? Whoever Googles it first.
All right, let's see. It is an airport, I'm pretty sure. Oh, it's in Detroit. Let's fucking go.
Yeah, it's a terminal. McNamara terminal.
Yeah, no, I largely echo what Pac has said. I do think it is more of a cultural thing, and you'll notice that when you actually do real sports for a little while, where, people are doing all sorts of warm-ups that aren't really substantiated, and they just do them because they do. And the same goes for powerlifting. Powerlifting is not that distinct in terms of culture from other sports. The same things still tend to happen. So yeah, I would say I hope this episode has left listeners with a better understanding and appreciation for what there is and isn't evidence for warming up. Yeah. But hey, whatever floats your boat, ultimately.
And that's real. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to another Stronger by Science podcast. Make sure to check out the website, strongerbyscience.com. And obviously, I'm not going to redo all the plugs as before, but hey, check out the communities. Check out
the coaching. strongerbyscience.com/coaching to get an expert coach to handle your training and nutrition today. Go there now, sign up. You'll get matched with an excellent coach who can handle all your stuff. Wolf coaching mode.
That was awesome. Yes, my brain there froze. And we will see you guys next time. We're preparing some really cool episodes for the podcast, and we look forward to sharing everything with you. From us to you, we bid you adieu. Peace.